A human being can learn a great deal without actually entering into a relationship with the eternal. That is, if a man who is learning looks at the external, then he can learn a great deal, but in spite of all this knowledge he can be and remain a mystery to himself, an unknown, as the wind drives the mighty ship, but the wind does not understand itself, as the river turns the wheel, but the river itself is without understanding, so a man may accomplish the astounding, embrace the manifold of knowledge, yet without understanding himself. Suffering, on the contrary, directs a man's attention inward. If that succeeds, the man will not despairingly resist it, seek to drown himself, and to forget it in worldly diversions, in amazing undertakings, in comprehensive, indifferent knowledge. If it succeeds, then the instruction in it begins. As we are accustomed to say about school life that it must be kept apart from worldly contacts, hedged in and barricaded, placid, a thing apart, then it is in all truth valid to say this concerning this school of suffering, for it is in the inward man where suffering instructs, where God is listening, where obedience is the test which is demanded. Suffering, indeed, frequently comes from without, but it is only when the suffering is assimilated in the inner man that the instruction begins. Many sufferings may rush in upon a man, and a man may in turn succeed in rushing, as they say, to preserve his health. That is, he may succeed in preventing himself from beginning on the instruction of suffering. Then too, worldly wisdom knows many remedies for sufferings, but these remedies all have the distressing characteristic that they save the body, but destroy the soul. Worldly wisdom also knows many methods for encouraging the sufferer, but these methods all have the distressing quality that they strengthen the body, but grieve the spirit. Then, too, worldly wisdom knows how to give the joy of life to those desperate through sufferings, but only inwardness in sufferings wins the eternal. When a man suffers and is willing to learn from what he suffers, then he constantly learns only something about himself and about his relationship to God. This is the sign that he is being trained for eternity. Alas, through his sufferings, a man indeed learns much about the world, how deceitful and treacherous it is, and much else of the same kind, but none of this knowledge is the instruction of suffering. No, as they say that a child must be weaned when it is too old to nurse, so must a man, in the most profound sense, be weaned from the world and from what is of the world, through sufferings, weaned from loving and from being embittered by it, in order to learn for eternity. Therefore the school of suffering is a dying away from the world, and the quiet hours of a dying away. In this school of suffering there are always quiet hours. The attention is not distracted by the many objects of learning, for here only the one thing needful is learned. The attention is not confused by fellow students, for here the learner is alone with God. The instruction is not questionable with regard to the learner's ability, for God is the teacher. Only one thing is learned: obedience. Without sufferings one cannot learn obedience, for suffering is exactly the assurance that the devotion is not willfulness. But he who learns obedience learns everything. Usually we say that one must learn to obey in order to learn to rule, and this is also true, but, nevertheless, one learns something still more excellent by learning obedience in the school of suffering. To let God rule, to let God counsel. But what indeed is all eternal truth other than this, that God rules? And what is obedience except this, letting God rule? And what other connection and agreement is indeed possible between the temporal and the eternal than that God rules and allowing God to rule? And where can this be learned except in the school of suffering, as when the child is weaned and the self-will dies away, and the sufferer first painfully learns that it is still God who rules before he learns in glad obedience to let God rule. Everything which a human being knows about the eternal is, on the whole, included in this. It is God who rules, for whatever more a human being learns concerns how God has ruled, or rules, or will rule. But in the language of obedience, this eternal truth is expressed in this way, letting God rule. It is one and the same thing, except that in obedience there is heard the humble, strengthening, confident assent of devotion in the obedience. If the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, then to learn obedience is the perfecting of wisdom. It is to advance in wisdom through being trained for the eternal. Moreover, if you, disciplined through suffering, have ever submitted yourself in perfect, unconditional obedience, then you have also felt the eternal present in yourself. You have found the rest and peace of the eternal in yourself.